From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thanks for coming out. Welcome to the library on a beautiful Thursday afternoon. I'm Rob Casper, head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the library, and I would like to welcome you to our fourth Bagley Wright Lecture on Poetry. Today, Bagley Wright Fellow Terrance Hayes will give a lecture titled Ideas of Influence, and he's the first lecturer to have a pretty intense audiovisual component, so we're excited about introducing that today. Before I begin, let me tell you a little bit about the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress. We are home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, and for over 76 years we have hosted programs of all kinds to promote literature. Everything from our Poet Laureate opening reading and closing lecture to noontime events like this. You can read more about the center at our website, www.loc.gov/poetry. You can also sign our sign-up sheet outside, and you can get information on upcoming events. I believe our next event is February 3rd, our series, Conversations with African Poets and Writers, which is always a lot of fun in the African and Middle Eastern Division reading room just upstairs. Also, let me tell you a little bit about today's format. Terrance will read for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and then we'll have a book signing later. There are some books in the back. Let me ask you to take this opportunity to turn off any electronic devices you have so they don't interfere with the recording of this event. We are recording this event, so please note that by participating in the Q&A session, you give the library permission for future use of the recording. The Bagley Wright Lecture Series on Poetry seeks to provide leading poets with the opportunity to explore in depth their own thinking on the subject of poetry and poetics, and arrange for the delivery of several lectures that result from these investigations. Last year, we enjoyed lectures by Dorothea Lasky, Joshua Beckman, and in December, Timothy Donnelly. This event marks the second half of the series, and after today, we will have two lectures remaining with fellows Srikanth Reddy and Rachel Zucker. So I hope you come back for those events as well. I feel a great appreciation for this group of poets and for the work the Bagley Wright Fellowship has allowed them to do. All six have much to add to our critical conversations about the art, and all six are friends of mine, and I'm excited to see what the three remaining lectures have to add to the wonderful three lectures that I know many of you got to attend before. That said, I have had a longer conversation with Terrance Hayes than with any of the other fellows. We've known each other for almost half our lives. I've seen Terrance grow up to accomplish everything listed in your print program, and seen how his spirit has continued to shine. He has always had a restless imagination in the best sense, and it is out of this restlessness that he will give his lecture today. Terrance is also the kind of person and poet who champions the messy beauty of life, and who looks to art for not just truth, but revelation. He is the friend I save up my most difficult and challenging questions for, and last night, over many drinks, I got a chance to ask a few of them. The friend who, with generosity and humility and instinctual insight, always finds a way to guide me to some deeper sense of being in the world. In poem after poem, book after book, he has done the same for his readers, and he will surely do so for us today. Please join me in welcoming Terrance Hayes.
Okay, so thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody. It's good to be here. I am going to try to do more reading than improvising, because that's usually when I get in trouble. So if I read and don't improvise, we'll be done in 35, 40 minutes. If I improvise, we'll be done tomorrow. So, and if you know anything about these talks, if you've seen any of the previous ones, they are sort of couched as working conversations, you know, sort of lectures in advance of what an essay might become. So I've tried to write them as essays for reasons I just explained, that if I lecture, then I'll be talking about like Bugs Bunny and his sexuality or something like that. You know, it could just go anywhere. So I'm trying to write essays and present them as lectures, but that's hard for me. So I'm gonna go, and then we'll kind of get into these slides. And so all my thank yous and acknowledgments are kind of built into the talk so that I won't, again, do what I'm already doing. All right, so the title of the talk pretty much tells you where we're going, a visual essay, lecture, ideas of influence, poetry, so we are thinking about broad implications of poetry, and then a poet, as you see in the image, Etheridge Knight, through the lens of Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From. In 2010, Where Good Ideas Come From was published by Stephen Johnson, actually a DC native. He was born in '68, I think, although he lives in Brooklyn now, like everybody. Author of several books on, as he says on his website, the intersection of science, technology, and personal experience. So he's the kind of charming, you know, fairly good looking for a white dude, I guess, cultural, intellectual TED Talks were made for. And he gives a pretty good TED Talk on the book, in fact. The book provides a framework for what is a broad and tiresome, and it feels particularly American obsession, which is how to unlock your creative potential. I mean, where good ideas come from, and then how to get paid too, I think. In our quarters, that translates to how to unlock your poetic potential, how to write good poems, where do good poems come from. And a talk on poetics is really about that question. What is a good poem? What is poetry? What is a poet? I'm grateful to Wave Books, Charlie Wright, and especially Matthew Zapruder for giving me a chance to spell out some of these questions and ideas. They usually seem less smart spelled out, actually. And I'm excited to be trying out this first visual lecture essay-a-majig here at the Library of Congress. Thanks to Rob Casper and the staffers for helping me set all of this up. I had a whole other setup, and then, so if anything screws up, I also blame Rob Casper and the staffers. So the perennial question of influence drifts in from a landscape still in the oppressive, or depending on your vantage, comical, if you read the book, blustery shadow of Harold Bloom's 1973 book, important but infinitely contestable, The Anxiety of Influence. You may have heard of it, but I don't know that many people who've read it. I've read it. Enough has been said about the book. Its arguments are really entitled, which is to say, you know what, let me put my clock on, make sure I'm keeping track of how long we're going here. The arguments are entitled, which is sort of to say, when you hear it, the anxiety of influence, you sort of know you don't necessarily need to read the book. You can just read the back cover and you get it. But entitled also means they're a little bit entitled, because essentially it's a book about culture wars. It's about a kind of a smart, but a gatekeeper, Harold Bloom, being concerned about the loss of a certain kind of tradition and a certain kind of power. So that's all in it. And then Jonathan Latham's 2007 Harper's essay, The Ecstasy of Influence, a plagiarism, provides a pretty good foil to Bloom's cultural anxieties. But I'm mentioning Bloom and Latham here at the outset to suggest that a lot's been said, enough has been said, and I don't intend to settle the discussion at all about influence, only to look at a few poems and a poet through the lens of Johnson's terms for innovation and creativity. So while the poet Etheridge Knight is my launch pad and anchor for this lecture, and in fact, all of the lectures I'm going to give, I think maybe there are 4 or 5, and he is essentially that, like the kind of thing that I hover around with these conversations. And I hope that that becomes clear over the course of the afternoon, why he's the person that I've chosen. So we're going to begin with the clip, one of those time-lapse clips. If you remember, like, I think UPS did this for a little while, where they had the whiteboard and they would draw out everything. It takes about 4 minutes. We're going to watch this clip, and it'll tell you everything you need to know about the book. Does anybody know that book, Where Good Ideas Come From, 2010? So I don't know why these guys write these books. I mean, it's a good book. I wasn't reading it, so now I'm improvising, because I wanted to be rich or anything. I just thought, like, sure, I'm curious, where do good ideas come from? And there are some useful things in it. But again, behind that, the stuff I took out of my talk was about the implications and the questions I now have about a phenomena like a TED Talk, and in fact, the phenomena of this sort of book. But I can't critique. I took it out because I don't want to critique the man if I'm really, really using his book to extend this conversation. So just edit all that out. All right, so here's a write-up on the book.
For the past 5 years, I've been investigating this question of where good ideas come from. It's a kind of problem I think all of us are intrinsically interested in. We want to be more creative. We want to come up with better ideas. We want our organizations to be more innovative. I've looked at this problem from an environmental perspective. What are the spaces that have historically led to unusual rates of creativity and innovation? And what I've found in all of these systems, there are these recurring patterns that you see again and again that are crucial to creating environments that are unusually innovative. One pattern I call the slow hunch, that breakthrough ideas almost never come in a moment of great insight, in a sudden stroke of inspiration. Most important ideas take a long time to evolve, and they spend a long time dormant in the background. It isn't until the idea has had 2 or 3 years, sometimes 10 or 20 years to mature, that it suddenly becomes accessible to you and useful to you in a certain way. And this is partially because good ideas normally come from the collision between smaller hunches so that they form something bigger than themselves. So you see a lot in the history of innovation, cases of someone who has half of an idea. There's a great story about the invention of the World Wide Web in Tim Berners-Lee. This is a project that Berners-Lee worked on for 10 years. But when he started, he didn't have a full vision for this new medium he was going to invent. He started working on one project as a side project to help him organize his own data. He scrapped that after a couple of years, and he started working on another thing. And only after about 10 years did the full vision of the World Wide Web come into being. That is, more often than not, how ideas happen. They need time to incubate, and they spend a lot of time in this partial hunch form. The other thing that's important when you think about ideas this way is that when ideas take form in this hunch state, they need to collide with other hunches. Oftentimes, the thing that turns a hunch into a real breakthrough is another hunch that's lurking in somebody else's mind. And you have to figure out a way to create systems that allow those hunches to come together and turn into something bigger than the sum of their parts. That's why, for instance, the coffee house in the age of the Enlightenment, or the Parisian salons of modernism, were such engines of creativity, because they created a space where ideas could mingle and swap and create new forms. When you look at the problem of innovation from this perspective, it sheds a lot of important light on the debate we've been having recently about what the internet is doing to our brains. Are we getting overwhelmed with an always connected, multitasking lifestyle? And is that going to lead to less sophisticated thoughts as we move away from the slower, deeper, contemplative state of reading, for instance? Obviously, I'm a big fan of reading. But I think it's important to remember that the great driver of scientific innovation and technological innovation has been the historic increase in connectivity and our ability to reach out and exchange ideas with other people, and to borrow other people's hunches and combine them with our hunches and turn them into something new. That really has, I think, been, more than anything else, the primary engine of creativity and innovation over the last 600 or 700 years. And so yes, it's true we're more distracted. But what has happened that is really miraculous and marvelous over the last 15 years is that we have so many new ways to connect and so many new ways to reach out and find other people who have that missing piece that will complete the idea we're working on, or to stumble serendipitously across some amazing new piece of information that we can use to build and improve our own ideas. That's the real lesson of where good ideas come from, that chance favors the connected mind.
Okay, so that's, you could get that book. You could check that out. And I'll give you a reading list. That's not on it because it really is, as I said, at the root of all we're talking about. So I'll come back to it. And there are some good things in it. I mean, for me, when you think about poetry all the time, as I think I do, I'm often trying to make connections. And because I do have a kind of ongoing interest in the nature of influence, I wanted to see if his theories, and you can see them sort of laid out there, might apply to our conversation. And as I said, I wanted to put at the heart of that question a poet like Knight. And I'll mention a few other poets who might fit into this kind of conversation, and maybe we can talk about that too with our Q&A. So here is really, I'm just going to show you a kind of an outline of what I'm trying to do in terms of adapting his terms. So for example, his conversation of the liquid network for us becomes poetic networks. And if you didn't quite follow what he's talking about, I will say the poetic network / liquid network is just, it's broad and it's often organized around a common idea. So as we'll see in a moment, like the beat movement is an example of a poetic network that is a liquid network. The confessional movement, the Black Arts movement we'll talk about, and even the kind of like MFA, associated writing programs, is a kind of a liquid network. So we want to test some of that out and see if in fact his term can be used as such. Also, this term for him, the liquid network, reminds me of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's term, liquid modernity. So if I go on a tangent, I'll say, like, I trust liquid modernity more than postmodernism, but again, we can talk about that later on. I don't believe in postmodernism. So it's a kind of chaotic continuation of modernity, he says, where one can shift from one social position to another in a fluid but uncertain manner. Bowman writes that nomadism becomes a general trait of the liquid modern man as he flows through his own life like a tourist, changing places, jobs, spouses, values, sometimes even more, such as political and sexual orientation. And so Etheridge Knight seems to me like a liquid modern man in various liquid poetic networks, and that's really what we want to look at. So again, you'll see, I was surprised at the number of philosophers I actually have in this thing. Somewhere in my, ambitions, maybe there's a philosopher or something. So again, that's what's going to lead me to give you a reading list here towards the end. But I thought, there's an interesting term. So we got liquid networks, we got liquid modernity, and then we have really this question of poetic networks. So this other term he uses, if I go back for a minute, the adjacent possible, for us are just poetic partnerships. It's actually an adaptation that Stephen Johnson takes from Stuart Kaufman, a biologist, a theoretical biologist. But it's more intimate than the liquid network. So the liquid network is just a big, large umbrella. And then the poetic network we can think of in fairly literal terms as partnerships, friendships, mentor-mentee relationships. I was thinking, as an example, a quick example would be Robert Lowell's. He really thrived on adjacent possibilities. His close friendship to Elizabeth Bishop, if you know, like Skunk Hour, his poem is really an imitation of the armadillo. People think it's the other way around, but it's not. She wrote her poem first, but she wrote so slowly. He wrote his poem after hers got in the New Yorker. See, now I'm improvising. And then he was like, I want to get a poem. Anyway, so there's that relationship. His second book after Life Studies was, in fact, Imitations. But also, even beyond that, his marriage for a long time, to Elizabeth Hardwick. They eventually divorced, and he used her letters in his book, The Dolphin. Another conversation. And finally, the adjacent possible relationships, even with his students. So Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. So that's the adjacent possible, just sort of being in that proximity, the kinds of ways that people are influenced by that kind of relationship. So for me, I just have the term poetic partnerships. And he, like Knight, could be discussed as a liquid modern man. And part of maybe where we're going are thinking about, are there other folks that might, suit this kind of term? So, and then we understand the slow hunch there in the middle. I think a slow hunch maybe is in terms of stamina, like waiting out an idea, if we're going to stay right alongside Stephen Johnson's term. But if we're just going hunch, I'm into the realm of like just intuition, like a hunch and intuition are very similar. And I would actually put the next thing, era, I would say I would add serendipity to that and then put that under the umbrella of poetic intuition. So if he has all of these terms, I'm looking right now at about 3 as opposed to the 4. So in his book and in that mini presentation, he sort of gives us the way that he's separating a hunch from an era. And I'm saying maybe for a creative person, for a poet or an artist, maybe there's a closer relationship between the hunch and the era, and then something like serendipity. So this other term, exaptation, I would just say it's like reading to write. Maybe it's something like imitation. So he says this it's very quick, so I'll spell it out a little bit. Exaptation originates as a biological term. It's the use of a structure or function for a purpose other than that for which it was initially evolved. So birds, for example, initially developed wings and feathers as a means of heat regulation, but they became a way to fly. So that's exaptation. And Johnson cites Gutenberg's printing press, which was primarily a repurposed wine press, and as an example of innovational exaptation. So there's a term. So for me, I'm thinking language itself is probably our best example of exaptation, as the meaning of words and terms are constantly being revised and repurposed. Reading to write, or imitation, is also a kind of exaptation when a poem or any art object is viewed, let's say, as a door to a new piece of art, a new poem, as opposed to, as we often think of imitation, a kind of mirror. So many times we look at Mona Lisa and we say we're going to do our version of Mona Lisa, but we're really in conversation and trying to mirror what's great in Mona Lisa. But exaptation says painting or replicating Mona Lisa should send us to a whole other place, Bugs Bunny. So when we think of it this way, influence and imitation become less a marker of apprenticeship or even mastery, and more markers of practice and process. So that's how I'm understanding that term. Platforms are, I think of, for us, workshops. For poets, it's the notion of the workshop. And they do sort of fit right in the middle of the adjacent possible, which are sort of two people in conversation, the intimacy of the adjacent possible, and then the largeness, the sort of general broadness of the liquid network. So for him, again, he's talking about it in more general terms, more technological and professional terms, and I'm thinking we all know sort of the phenomena of the workshop if we have any sense of sort of what's happening for poets these days. And what do I have here? Platforms are akin to workshop environments, the MFA, the community workshops, Writers' Corps here in DC, that spring up in living rooms and libraries, retreat workshops. Perhaps the success of a workshop leads to a network, and there I'm thinking of an organization like Galway Canal, which really began as a retreat workshop, intimate but not adjacent possible, but intimate enough, but over almost 20 years now, we could say it's really a kind of impressive network. Not as big as the MFA network, but it runs counter to something like a beat movement or a black arts movement. So again, the stages of the liquid network, maybe it kind of keeps spreading. So finally, I won't apply Johnson's 4 quadrants down. You can only see it down at the bottom. I don't think it comes up. He mentions this at the end. And again, we're sort of really getting into entrepreneurial relationships and business models at the end of it. I'm less interested in that. And so I'm just thinking like what we're really moving towards are the ways that our relationships can help us collaborate and be more productive. And what the quadrant idea really points to most importantly is that creativity and influence thrive in workshop environments that are diverse, generous, and fluid. So that's already a kind of debatable comment, which is to say, can creativity and poetry thrive in isolation or even just in an adjacent possible relationship? And I would say I don't think it thrives only in a liquid network or in a poetic network. So that middle ground, which is some combination of intimacy and network, or encountering people who aren't in your immediate sphere, which is sort of what can happen in a workshop. I would say that really, in his 4th quadrant stuff, is what he's talking about, but we're not going to talk about that. But finally, such environments are at the root of our most successful poetic schools and movements. So at the end of it all, you have a kind of a circle. Once we have an organization like the Beats or the New York School Poets or the Galway Canal Poets or AWP Poets, the hope is that other kind of networks grow out of that network, other kind of partnerships grow out of that, other kinds of intuitions, other kind of productivity, and the idea is that that circle continues. So, I mean, I really could stop there, but I have like 60 more pages to go. But that's the outline. So, looking now, these next slides are fairly self-evident. It's the work of a New York-based artist, Waris Shelley. He makes flowcharts in ink and paint on large sheets of mylar. His works have titles like The History of Science Fiction, which is what that one is, and Who Invented the Avant-Garde. They're probably too small for you to see, but what I really want you to see is just sort of the elaborateness of them, and also they're pretty big. So Shelley has a painting called The Beats, and there it is, 29 by 59 inches. So it covers a big wall, and I'll try to explain it because I think you probably can't see it that well there. And the Beats, for example, convincingly cast the movement as one of the most significant poetic networks of American poetry in the last century. Its influence is more local and therefore more measurable than something like modernism or even modernism's liquid network. Modernism is just such a large term. If we're really thinking about networks and poetic networks, I think we want to look at something like this, like the Beat movement. Modernism is actually more pervasive than liquid. It's like air, an atmosphere, a vaporous network. But the beat's liquid network, as Shelley shows us, is specific but far-reaching enough to touch writers across a broad cultural spectrum. His painting visualizes the workshop, the adjacent possible relationships, and all the other things that kind of made the beat movement what it is. So at the start, here's a little bit larger version of it. At the start, to the far left, we can see the main men there, drawn in, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, and Allen Ginsberg, the central poet of the movement and thus one of the most influential poets of the last century. Shelley places him in New York with Kerouac and Burroughs. You can sort of see that in that gray area, sort of to the middle of it in this zoom in the 40s, and then in San Francisco with Peter Orlowski and Lawrence Ferlinghetti in the 50s, and then back in New York with Leroy Jones as the beatsploitation ends, or maybe morphs into hippiedom, or I don't know what comes after the beats. I think it's flower power. So if you can see these images, and on one of these slides, is it on this one? His website is there. It's warisshelley.com or something like that. So they're pretty interesting. He also had one that I took out because I thought, again, distraction. Carol Schneemann, do you know who Carol Schneemann is? The sort of avant-garde artist with the scrolls, the vagina scrolls. So that's why I took it out. So we'll keep moving. If you look him up, you'll get it. So here's my version. Did I skip that? Where's the downtown one? Okay, so Shelley's painting, the downtown body, presents a more geographical liquid network as it maps 100 years of the downtown New York art scene. Its literary artery draws a more substantial connection between the beats and other poetry movements in the New York poets, the Nuyorican poets, the poetry slam poets. So let me get a little closer so you can see what I'm talking about here. So this is a zoom in on this. He's really thinking about the avant-garde, the New York scene, 100 years of that. And then he has this sort of gray thread running through that large one here. You can see it sort of at the top, which is what's happening. So now the beats just become one part of it. That red section, before we get to it, is like McCarthyism. But so now the beats just have a moment. He still has Ginsberg, Kerouac, and Burroughs listed there. But then that goes into the New York school. As I said, it goes into the Nuyorican poets and the slam poets. This painting also illustrates the role publication plays in the spread of poetic networks. And then note how the magazines and periodicals decrease in the era of new professionalism. So Shelley's painting ends with this period, the end of 1990. So we're left to guess, and I think we can guess, the impact of new professionalism on the liquid literary network. So it's sort of like, where would he go after 2000 if we see new professionalism? And he doesn't define it. He doesn't say what it is. But as I said, I think we can sort of begin to think about it. So what I have is a square. It's literally a square. But this is my version of what he's done, just sort of playing around in a graphics program. So very quickly, this, like this is pretty much a little history. This is 100 years of American poetry. So there's W.W.E.D., Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson. So the rest of it you can fill out. Do I need to say the names? Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, Langston Hughes, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens. And then we get into like Baraka, the four dudes. You see they're almost all dudes, which is really what it was. Baraka, O'Hara, Lowell, Ginsberg. But at the end of that, what you see around the 1990s where he's sort of leaving. So I'm thinking if I was going to extend this, where would we get? We get spoken word, we get associated writing programs, we get names like Paul Beatty, Yusuf Komunyakaa, Mark Doty, Ann Carson. And so that's me sort of speculating on what happens on the end of that lineology that he's creating for us. So my square illustration equates professionalism with the rise of the MFA programs. The MFA associated writing programs is our present prominent example of the poetic network with all its problems and advantages. I don't mean this as a repudiation of the MFA network. In many ways, it serves the same purpose as the preceding networks, that is to create adjacency, relationships. Moreover, despite the size of the MFA network, it has not eradicated the community workshop, that stage of influence between the network and partnership. So then that just runs through. There's Breadloaf with Frost, there's Kaveh Khanum, a bunch of people sitting around. And then there's the annual MFA programs phenomena that happens in Poets and Writer every year for the last few years. So just to say again that it's pretty pervasive, and the feature of the workshop the way the workshop thrives gives us a sense of the prominence of something like the MFA workshop. So then I have little moments in here where I'm just sort of talking. So when I was a first-year grad student seeking something beyond the MFA workshop, I attended a community workshop every third Saturday. This group, minus myself, held no university students, though it happened in the shadow of the University of Pittsburgh. The workshop had been founded by August Wilson and a band of young black poets. By the time I showed up, August was gone, but a few of the founders were there, among a steel mill working aspiring playwright, an ex-con heroin addict who actually had run in his day with Etheridge Knight, a lonely old woman who wore, whatever the weather or time of year, a beige raincoat and floppy interstellar rain visor. She was a black Marianne Moore, she really was. She was a widow, though any reference to her late husband was replaced by poems of lucid carnal desire. It tickled her to read them. It tickled us to hear them. Sometimes the South African poet Dennis Brutus would make a cameo. A steady flow of changing, sporadic faces would emerge, summoned by the 2 decades old mailing list. So I'm not implying an unfavorable view of MFA workshops, though I am generally unfavorable of the MFA workshop culture, so much as suggesting that the community workshop also fosters and extends a platform even when the poets do not possess or maybe do not have access to the professional network or the new professionalism that seems to be dominant these days. So the Poetry Retreat is an ideal platform for a kind of academic poet or an MFA poet, really to rub shoulders with a community poet, an experimental poet. So I'm thinking again of Kaveh Khanum, Kundiman, Breadloaf, Naropa, any summer workshop where poets have traveled to be together. And again, that's why it falls in the middle of like what we think of as the adjacent possible, where it's like, well, we live together, we see each other a lot. The poetic network where we maybe never see each other, though we know that other poets are out there. And then this idea of the workshop as a place where people are sort of coming from different regions and bringing that information, that experience for different regions. So the New York School poets present a kind of community city retreat workshop. The New York writing circles predate the MFA network, the language school network, but the poets with their numerous periodicals and collaborations were certainly professional. There too, the poets traveled to be together, even if it was, as in the case of Allen Ginsberg and Leroy Jones, only as far as New Jersey. Here we see Ginsberg, Jones, and O'Hara, 3 of the most important poets of the last 50 or 60 years, reading in New York City at the Living Theater. I think the Living Theater is actually still around. The theater was a kind of workshop platform as it featured the work of American writers like Gertrude Stein, William Carlos Williams, Kenneth Rexroth, John Ashbery, and Leroy Jones's play Dutchman opened there in 1964. So I can almost imagine a world in which it's Leroy Jones that is the model for our liquid modern man. He, Leroy Jones, is a link between Ginsberg and the Beat Network, O'Hara and the New York School, and he's a link between Amiri Baraka and the Black Arts Movement. He flows through networks like a tourist, changing places, spouses, names, values, and orientations, if you know anything about Frank O'Hara and the biography written by Frank O'Hara. So the idea that the liquid man also sometimes switches sexual orientations, but we don't know for sure if that's true of Baraka. But we know he changed names, spouses, places. So in his 2006 book, Beautiful Enemies, Andrew Epstein says, during a crucial 8-year period as the 1950s turned into the 1960s, Baraka came to embody an exciting experiment in collaboration, friendship, and intertextuality across traditional boundaries of race. Few, if any, major African-American writers have ever been as thoroughly enmeshed in a community of white writers, lovers, and friends as Baraka, and few have so dramatically extricated themselves from this kind of interracial dialogue. So I recommend Epstein's book to you, as it was recommended to me by poet Stephen Burt. Here's a book copy description, because it really is very much in league with our conversation. This is from the book. Although it has long been commonplace to imagine the archetypal American poet singing a solitary song of myself, much of the most enduring American poetry has actually been preoccupied with the drama of friendship. Andrew Epstein argues that an obsession with both the pleasures and problems of friendships erupts in the new American poetry that emerges after the Second World War. Beautiful Enemies reveals a fundamental paradox at the heart of post-war American poetry and culture. The avant-garde's commitment to individualism and nonconformity runs directly counter to its valorization of community and collaboration. So again, the book really does fit. But as I said, there's a problem, and I'm gonna come to that problem. But first, when we're thinking about Leroy Jones, this is just one of my drawings with black art in the back. When we're thinking about Leroy Jones and how for that moment, let's say for 8 to 10 years, when he really is our example of the liquid modern man, Epstein describes this cover of Floating Bear, which is a magazine. And I think that this could, did that not come up yet? There it is. I think that maybe Leroy Jones drew that. I couldn't find out who drew it. But Epstein describes this cover of Floating Bear, a magazine Leroy Jones edited in the early 60s as such. So you won't be able to see what's written in it, but this is what it is. The cover of the 1963 Christmas issue of the Floating Bear nearly captures Baraka's centrality to the New York universe, the American poetry universe. It features a Santa Claus figure sitting on a toilet, the toilet being the title of a 1963 play that Baraka did, and then reading Baraka's newly published book, Blues People, and surrounded by a wide variety of names, almost entirely of white writers involved in the intertwined circle of the bohemian New American poetry scene. There are the New York school poets like Frank O'Hara on the right, beats like Ginsberg behind his head, Black Mountain affiliates like John Wieners, the painter Robert Rauschenberg, journalists like Locust Solis, Partisan Review, Evergreen Review, as well as predecessors like Ezra Pound at the top. So that's what all of the drawing is, although you can't quite see it. I think Epstein has a website. Maybe I got this off of his website, so if you wanted to get a closer look, you could find it there. So Leroy Jones was the model of our liquid modern man, but when he became Amir Baraka, he also seems to have become less susceptible to influence. This is not a critique of his political transformation so much as a mourning of the diminishing impact of fluidity as he aged. He remained, like it or not, at the center of contemporary American poetry. He remained engaged in partnerships. Allen Ginsberg was always one of his dearest friends. And he remained involved actually in workshops. For example, he and his wife Amina hosted monthly salons open to folks of diverse races and backgrounds at their home for many years. So in that way, we could say, yeah, he continued to be a liquid modern man. Why aren't we talking about him instead of Etheridge Knight? But his poems, I've just last month reviewed SOS, the collected poems coming out from Grove Press, any day now, I guess. In his poems, there is less and less evidence of experiment or the era/serendipity associated with influence. Influence, when you hold the word a certain way, is synonymous with vulnerability and openness, and I think that was not one of his interests, or kind of art that displayed a certain vulnerability. And that's sort of where I go. I say such elements were replaced by his maturing mastery and style. Baraka, he got older, he figured out what he wanted to do, he knew what poetry was. I would say they were replaced by maturing mastery and style if I valued words like mastery and style, which I do not. I don't think that those are good terms for us. So as I mentioned earlier, I fit Stephen Johnson's markers of era, serendipity, and hunches under poetic intuition, a term related to philosopher. Here's another philosopher, Jacques Maritain, which people used to know, but nobody really knows anymore, the French philosopher. In his 1960 book, based on lectures he'd given at Princeton, The Responsibility of the Artist, which you can find online, actually, Jacques Maritain provides a succinct reasoning for the value of creative intuition versus the socialist realist tradition. So there's a separation between those two. And this is just something he says. I just think it's a good quote. Poets do not come on stage after dinner to afford ladies and gentlemen previously satiated with terrestrial food the intoxication of pleasures which are of no consequence. But neither are poets waiters who provide these same people with the bread of existential nausea, Marxist dialectics, or traditional morality, the beef of political realism or idealism, and the ice cream of philanthropy. They provide mankind with the spiritual food, which is intuitive experience, revelation, and beauty. So does that make sense? He's just sort of thinking about, like, what are we feeding you? What do poets feed the audience? And so we're not waiters, we're not feeding you ice cream, we're not feeding you beef. So essentially he says we're feeding a kind of spiritual food. And so I think that's relative to where we're going. So I'll spend a little time on this slide here. It looks like we're about halfway through here, so that's good. As Leroy Jones settled into Amiri Baraka, so too did the liquidity of the Black Arts movement settle into its form. In 1968, Baraka and Larry Neal co-edited Black Fire, an anthology of African American writing, which is often considered the seminal work from the Black Power movement. We wanted the oral tradition in our work. We wanted sound, the pumping rhythm of Black music, Baraka tells us. And so his poem, Black Art, is an amplification of the new aesthetics. And I don't know if you know that poem. It's been around for a while. We want poems that kill, assassin poems, poems that shoot guns, poems that wrestle cops in the alley and take their weapons. So its declaration against vulnerability, which is the same as passivity for Baraka, in poetry comes in lines like, let there be no love poems written until love can exist freely and cleanly. Let Black people understand that they are the lovers and the sons of lovers and warriors. The boldness of such a poem and the dynamic Black arts movement aesthetic impacted many young Black poets. Neal and Baraka were contributors, along with poets like Sonia Sanchez, Victor Hernandez Cruz, Jay Wright, and even Stanley Crouch, which if you know anything about Stanley Crouch, that's crazy. So that Black female poets like Audre Lorde, whose debut book, The First City, appeared that same year, and then Lucille Clifton, who was actually a classmate of Baraka's at Howard University before he dropped out, whose Good Times debuted a year later, were not included in Black Fire, really highlights the anthology and the movement's sort of narrowness in terms of nationhood, which was really closer to manhood, which is important, but they didn't call it manhood. There are only 4 women poets, including among the 40 men in the anthology. But of course, 3 years after Black Fire, 3 years being about the time it would take to do your own anthology, Detroit's Dudley Randall published The Black Poet. So Dudley Randall's like he's sort of like the Barry Gordy of, he's actually from Detroit, but he put on a whole bunch of people with his broadside press. So he's like the Barry Gordy of publishing. He directly states in his intro, Dudley Randall does, that Black Fire does not include Robert Hayden, it does not include Donnell Lee, Gwendolyn Brooks, Etheridge Knight. So Gwendolyn Brooks and Etheridge Knight were both closely associated with the Black arts movement, and again, especially in terms of like adjacent possible relationships, but they weren't in it. So 3 years later, Randall creates his anthology and includes them. While Lorde, Clifton, Brooks, and Knight wrote poems that could speak directly to Black people, which is to quote Larry Neal, their work differed from the prescribed Black arts poem in various ways, and I think we can guess at some of the ways. But be that as it may, I'm placing them at the nexus of the new Black arts poetry in 1968. Those poets, along with Baraka, influenced the Black arts movement just as much as the movement influenced them. So I'm thinking here of the reciprocal influence of the sort Michael Baxendall describes in his book, Patterns of Intention. Influence is a curse of art criticism primarily because of its wrong-headed grammatical prejudice about who is agent and who is patient. This is Baxendall. Baxendall really insists that the river of influence flows in 2 directions. And then he says, quote, arts are a positional game, and each time an artist is influenced, he rewrites the art's history a little. So I shouldn't try categorizing these 4 too simplistically, but one could argue that Black arts poetry had never been represented so broadly. And in fact, they're all born within a few years of each other. Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez were both born in 1934. Audre Lorde and Lucille Clifton were both born in 1936. So I can say that their generation rewrote poetry's history more than a little bit. So again, I won't go down too far down the road. I just have a few lines that you can see there. But even if you know only 1 or 2 of these names, you can see how they really do open up our notion of what like a Black arts movement was, just by virtue of their diversity, their different interests, their different locales, their different adjacent possible relationships, their different models for workshops. So now we are moving into Knight. So Knight was born in 1931. So he's older than those other guys, but only about 5 years or so. But he was considerably more seasoned. Before his conviction of armed robbery at 29, he would have likely been just as influenced by the cultural shifts in mid-century America as his peers. The Korean War and the echo of 2 world wars abroad, Brown versus Board of Education, Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, and other such signals of the civil rights movement here in the nation. And then in his own home, there's a kind of second wave migration of Blacks heading north for work as his family moved from Mississippi to Kentucky and then to Indiana. But where Baraka, Sanchez, Clifton, and Lord represented a kind of growing black college educated class, Knight dropped out of school at 14, enlisted in the Army, and then absorbed many of the substances and the sounds he encountered. I came to poetry not through any academic channels, he told Charles Rowell in the late 70s. And then he adds, all of the 50s were a whole drug scene. I fell and went to prison. The range of experiences dramatically separates Knight from his cohort, and I would also say the range of those experiences, how we sort of begin to see him as a more typical kind of model liquid man. I don't want to make a case for the idea of ancestry as the quintessential black or black arts poem, or for Knight as the quintessential blues or black arts or black poet. Influence, as I'm arguing, is not about primacy, but collaboration, not thesis, but synthesis. Knight, it must be said, was an uneven poet. He produced few poems, especially after his release from prison in '68, but he remains a quintessential liquid modern man. One who, to quote Zygmunt Bowman, who told us about the Liquid Network, had to splice together an unending series of short-term projects and episodes that didn't add up to the kind of sequence to which concepts like career and progress could be meaningfully applied. In his interview with Raw, Knight pretty much said, I live by poeting, I live from the people, I don't do anything but poet. Sometimes people attach me to universities. If I didn't poet, then I'd be a thief because that's how I started. I don't know anything else except to hustle. So Knight was, to use Bowman's description of the liquid modernist, constantly ready and willing to change tactics and short-term notice, to abandon commitments and loyalties without regret, and to pursue opportunities according to their availability, which is really the definition of a hustler. He was always ready to hustle. Hustling gave him access to a range of social circles. He wore his street cred, his trillness, which would be a portmanteau. Y'all know what a portmanteau is. A portmanteau of true and real, that's what trill is. As a badge of honor that allowed him to enter many, many social circles. He was, as I've heard from dozens, often lent money, and it was charming as a fox. He possessed the slippery tongue of a romantic. He was a romantic, doomed by all the classic troubles of a bluesman, trouble with love, trouble with law, trouble with place. And so I will let him hear this poem. We'll hear this poem of ideal ancestry, and then I'll talk a little bit more, and then maybe we'll open it up. So let's hear him read this poem.
I started making up this poem when I was in solitary one time. After being called by a number for 5 years, 30,562, I was beginning to forget who I was. The idea of ancestry. Taped to the wall of my cell are 47 pictures, 47 black faces. My father, mother, grandmothers, one dead, grandfathers, both dead, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, first and second, nieces and nephews. They stare across the space at me, sprawling on my bunk. I know their dark eyes, they know mine. I know their style, they know mine. I am all of them, they are all of me. They are farmers, I am a thief. I am me, they are thee. I have at one time or another been in love with my mother, one grandmother, 2 sisters, 2 aunts, one went to the asylum, and 5 cousins. I am not in love with a 7-year-old niece. She sends me letters written in large block print, and her picture is the only one that smiles at me. I have the same name as one grandfather, 3 cousins, 3 nephews, and 1 uncle. The uncle disappeared when he was 15, just took off and caught a freight, they say. He's discussed each year when the family has a reunion. He causes uneasiness in the clan. He is an empty space. My father's mother, who is 93 and who keeps the family Bible with everybody's birth dates and death dates in it, always mentions him. There is no place in her Bible for whereabouts unknown. Each fall, the graves of my grandfathers call me. The brown hills and red gullies of Mississippi send out their electric messages, galvanizing my genes. Last year, like a salmon quitting the cold ocean, leaping and bucking up his birth stream, I hitchhiked my way from LA with 16 caps in my pocket and a monkey on my back. And I almost kicked it with the kinfolk. I walked barefooted in my grandmother's backyard. whiskey from fruit jars with the men. I flirted with the women. I had a ball till the caps ran out and my habit came down. That night, I looked at my grandmother and split. My guts were screaming for jump, but I was almost contented. I had almost caught up with me. The next day in Memphis, I cracked a Coca's crib for a fix. This year, there is a gray stone wall damming my stream, and when the falling leaves stir my jeans, I pace my cell or flop on my bunk and stare at 47 black faces across the space. I am all of them, they are all of me. I am me, they are thee, and I have no suns to float in the space between.
Okay. So one of the things I would point out is his comment that he began reading that poem, working on that poem while he was in solitary confinement. So some of the questions are, what really would have been the impact of his workshops with folks like Dudley Randall and Gwendolyn Brooks, who came and visited him and sort of worked with him in the visiting room of the prison in Indiana. So we know that he's impacted by the moment. I mean, he's written about that elsewhere, about the Black Arts movement sort of infiltrating the prison and the prisoners sort of being transformed by that. So we have something like the kind of cultural network influencing him, but he would not really say just how much they helped him. So what that means is that the poems really remain quite unique, I think, to themselves, even as they speak to broader ideas about like African-American identity. It's what separates him. But what I would say that one of the people who surely must have influenced him in this regard would be Gwendolyn Brooks, who was there in the prison and who we know had a pretty sophisticated idea of what it means to be black. So she was influenced by the Black Arts movement. Her book, From the Mecca, also came out in 1968. It was on that plaque. It was nominated for a National Book Award. I don't think it won one, but I think it was nominated for one. But that was really a reflection, too, of the times and of her sort of absorbing some of these new movements. So by the time he was out of prison, though, and you'll see, I won't talk too long about this, I have gone through that poem and just sort of highlighted moments and really thought about what those moments mean in the poem. So a line like, I know their style. When he got out of prison, he sort of went right into the movement. Both, I'm gonna, because I don't want to take too much longer here, I'll just sort of talk about some of the stuff and only read the things that I need to read. So that may mean that I'll start repeating myself. But so as soon as he gets out of prison, he is very much plugged into the network, both because of Brooks and Dudley Randall, who were publishing a lot of the Black Arts poets, but also because he married Sonia Sanchez. So the wild thing about their marriage is that she saw some of his poems. They began a letter writing sort of relationship. Dudley Randall was sort of in the middle, making sure they were hooked up. They had never seen each other. They wrote a few letters. I'm trying to think about anyway, she hadn't really seen him until September, and then they got married in November. So they had been sort of writing. And then 2 years later, they were divorced, which of course makes sense if you marry someone you hadn't seen for that long. So what I'll say about these images, without going through them too quickly, is that he was very much a chameleon. So this is him giving a talk. He sort of got on his black beret and all black, sort of black arts outfit in 1972. And then these are some other images of him. Here's him as kind of professorial in 1982, and then him as a kind of homeboy in 1979. So it really says, and of course I've just sort of picked these pictures, but they're to underscore this idea of his fluidity in terms of persona. And I want to read this quote to you, which is something that he said. He's quoted by Larry Neal, who's writing an essay in '68 about the Black Arts movement, and he's just quoting some of the key figures. And so he quotes here something Etheridge Knight says about black aesthetics. Knight says, unless the black artist develops a black aesthetic, he will have no future at all. To accept the white aesthetic is to accept and validate a society that will not allow him to live. The black artist must create new forms and new values, sing new songs, or purify old ones. And along with other black authorities, he must create a new history, new symbols, myths, and legends, and purify old ones by fire. Further, he must hasten in his own disillusion as an individual in the Western sense, painful though the process may be, having been breastfed on the poison of quote unquote individual experience. It's actually in quotes. So I think that's either humor, hypocrisy, or hustle. especially when I think about the sort of isolated individual of so many of his poems, including the idea of ancestry like that, is really rooted in individual experience, if nothing else. So I think, yes, there's some charlatan in the statement, but we could also call it adaptability. We could also call it influence, the way that, again, depending on his social circle, he was going to say what he needed to say. As with Brooks, there's little evidence of a kind of like set, stagnant belief in his poems. Instead, it's all fluid, it's all liquid. The things that he believes, the things that he sort of chooses to go to. So when he writes in the idea of ancestry, I have been at one time or another in love, he reveals first and foremost his relentless romanticism, his desire to be influenced, which is sort of what you might think about love. And this is sort of Plato too, right? In the Symposium, the idea that friendships, platonic love, and erotic love, it's all about influence. It's all about absorbing the influence of your partner. So in that regard, he certainly was a classic romantic. So then I have a bunch of stuff here about all these different kinds of workshops around the group. So he was often in love. He was married 5 times through a combination of law and common law arrangements, never for more than 5 or 6 years. And a lot of the poems sort of underscore that. Upon Your Leaving is dedicated to Sonia Sanchez. Feeling Fucked Up is also a great poem, but also very much about her. And then you can hear in the names of the poems, a poem for a certain lady on her 33rd birthday, a poem for Mary McAnally, a wife, a poem for a Brookline lady I love. This is her apartment. All these poems are to women who were both poets and lovers. And shortly after divorce to Sonia Sanchez, he married Mary McAnally, mentioned at the end of this poem, let's see if this comes next, with a poem, The Galway Canal. So right around the time he divorces Sonia Sanchez, we have the first sort of indication of him moving into another network. And it's with Mary McAnally. Inevitably, it's in Minnesota, but it's the deep image poets. It's Robert Bly, Galway Canal, James Wright. You know, they shared work, they sent each other work, they wrote poems back and forth. So you can look at this poem very quickly, and again, it's like, I know their styles, that mantra comes through. As you see, it's not quite the idea of ancestry poem, but it's also certainly not like a Black artist aesthetic poem. And so it's very personal, epistolary. I mean, it also has a lot of landscape, some of the things that we might think of him having absorbed from the deep image poets. And some of the things that I've highlighted and circled go to the way that the poem has a different kind of interest in, or is a kind of adapting Bly's notion of the deep image poet. So let me see, where am I here? This other poem, this is a poem from his first book for Langston Hughes, from Poems from Prison. So Knight's poem to Langston Hughes depicts a not revolutionary or political violence associated with Black arts. Again, if you think about Baraka's poem, we want poems that are guns, but violence associated with grief. I shared this poem in the Black Poets Speak Out recently precisely because it suggests anger and outrage often cover deeper emotions. Anger often covers heartbreak. As Knight devotes such a poem to Hughes, he asked me to reconsider the influence of Hughes. The same is happening for Knight as many young poets contemplate and expand his influence. We change our influences just as much as they change us. So I'm really echoing back this idea of Baxendall's about rewriting history, rewriting what your influences are, even though it seems stagnant. And so with that, I'll show you just a couple of slides here of his influences. And I think this is right around the time of his, he gave himself a wake. He threw himself a wake when he found out he was about to die in the early 90s. So there's a young Yusuf Komunyakaa at his wake. And then here, a few years ago, a band of poets, mostly Kabakanan poets, were sort of touring, giving readings that were sort of inspired by some of Etheridge Knight's themes. So there, you know, I see Randall and Marcus Jackson are sort of on both posters, but it sort of shifted depending on who was where. There's Dwayne Betts, local poet. You might, well, he's not local, but he's local celebrity in DC. People in DC know who Dwayne is, let's say that. So, but he's got a much larger reputation. So again, I'm suggesting here, and what I'm skipping over is just this idea of the extended influence in the way that younger poets are still trying to think about Knight and extending this idea of liquidity, I think. So I'm gonna go here really quickly through this little reading list. The books I left off were like Anxiety of Influence, which y'all know. But this is the Beautiful Enemies book. This is Jacques Maritine's The Responsibility of the Artist, which you can actually, as I said, get online. This one, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, is also a good book. I think people don't like it anymore because he was Catholic or something. He was like a Catholic philosopher, which seems paradoxical maybe, but it's interesting. He's interesting. There's Liquid Modernity, Zygmunt Bowman. It's just that first name that I love. Patterns of Intention. And then this is a really important book in terms of Etheridge Knight. It's part biography and part critical study by Michael Collins, Understanding Etheridge Knight. I think that came out in 2012. But we're not quite done yet. I do want to talk about this because we want to get back to this idea of exaptation. So the liquid network, the adjacent possible, the hunch, I think all those things are clear. But to spend an extra moment on like how the sphere of influence really impacts us means I got to bring up one more philosopher, and that's Giambattista Vico from 1668 to 1744. So Vico, I'll just call him Vico, was an Italian political philosopher and rhetorician whose verum factum principle stated that truth is verified through creation and not, as Descartes would say, through observation. So this is how I summed it up. And I really could just stop here. I don't need to say much else about him. So if Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, Vico would say, I make, therefore I grasp. So he believes that the truth is verified through what you make, how you move through the world. And so I think that's certainly true. What else would I say about him? The idea that we can know ourselves, one of his ideas is that we can't really know ourselves because we have not created ourselves. But we can know computers, we can know cars, anything that we made, we can understand. So the best way to understand poetry, which is made by men, is to imitate it. And that again goes back to this principle I said earlier in terms of making work as a kind of doorway into new work, imitating work as a doorway into new work, as opposed to making work as a kind of imitation, essentially, as a mirror of the old work. What else? That's what I want to say there about him. The end of looking and reading is doing. This is also true of politics, by the way. The end of saying is doing. Exaptation suggests we cannot always know what will result of that doing. We can't know our plans to build a wine press will result in a printing press. And this, according to Stephen Johnson, and I think to me, is really the key to innovation, which is surprise. And that's what we hope comes out of influence, the idea that influence always leads you to a place you might not have always been. So I'm going to do this circle. Now, I had one more slide with a poem, and I think I could end there with that poem, and then we could talk a little bit if there's still time. So this is just a summary of how I understand these things to be working, and I want to emphasize again that the closest to the center circle is the most important thing. So liquid network, poetic network, Black Arts Movement, AWP movement, the platform as workshop, that space where you don't live with these people, but you know them. Maybe they live in your city, maybe they've traveled somewhere to meet you. Exaptation as revolutionary, reading and writing, the adjacent possible, partnerships, collaborations, and then you and your hunches is sort of one way to think about the organization of these moments. And then I'll just go through. What I'll say about these poems without reading them is that he just sort of happens to show up in every other book, Etheridge Knight. So in my very first book, I have a poem that's dealing with the poem he wrote called As You Leave Me. And then I said, okay, no more at night poems. I published the book. And then in Wind in the Box, I have a series of blue poems. And this is a poem sort of in the voice of Etheridge Knight, Dear Parole Board, or The Perennial Now. So I left them alone in Lighthead. And then in a more recent book, this poem, Portrait of Etheridge Knight, in the style of a crime report, is sort of playing around with some of the mythology around him, and also playing around with like how he went to jail. The reason he went to jail. People have different stories about that, and we could talk about that too. I won't go into the truth of that story, but this poem in 3 parts is again another example of me trying to engage Etheridge Knight as a way of doing, as a way of making, as opposed to as a way of just observing. If you hear where that comes from, why this emerges at the end of the talk. I'm still trying to play out Vico's theory Actually, I heard, the way I heard about Vico was I was just at a party talking about, I like for my kids to imitate. I think that's the best way for them to understand everything. And then the guy I was saying this to said, "Oh, you're a vegan." And then I said, "I like meat, And, and I went home and I looked it up and was like, "Oh yeah, Vico, that is what I am." So, and again, you can see what these things mean, the dialectic, your ideas, other ideas, and then the new ideas, again, just a few. And then like why all this matters at the end is this John Baldessari painting, "I will not make any more boring art." So I think I'm gonna stop there. I had a few other things that maybe will come up in the Q&A, but I hope that's enough for us to have a little bit of a conversation here for a little while.
To kind of run a community workshop that's been around a long time. And what interests me is that a lot of the participants in the workshop don't have any connection to academic or AWP
Sure.
poetry or anything like that.
Right.
But in some ways, I think their poetry is more interesting for that because their poetry is almost an isolation of certain things, and it kind of is mutated into something that's interesting and incorrect, I guess, whatever incorrect means
Sure.
at the same time. So would you have anything to say about that?
Well, I would say like the idea of liquidness and fluidity is not about closed spaces. So I sort of suggested at the end, there is a space, and maybe it's like a summer workshop, retreat workshop. Well, that seems like an ideal space where the community poet or the poet who works in isolation comes in contact with some of the poets who've been up in the tower or even far out in the avant-garde, and they sort of find that space to work together. So my theory is that it's really not about being closed off. And that would be the implicit critique of something like the Black Arts Movement as it's sort of received in most textbooks, which is to say, it was much more open than we think. And in fact, it becomes much more complicated when we think of it as an open space with a lot of different aesthetics working in that moment. So what I would say about the community group is that, like, sure, their strength is there at that table, but what you hope they'll do is find their ways into other workshops and other circles and other networks, because everybody benefits from that. Whatever the weird stuff that they've learned, the people who aren't in that table benefit from that, and they also benefit from hearing some of that outside input, if that makes any sense. So again, I just always go back to the notion of liquid. It's why I connected this network to this idea of sort of what is a liquid modern man. The question is that sort of comes up at the end of this is like, well, who would that really be if I've said, and I did sort of say this, that, Etheridge Knight wasn't tremendously productive. He was most productive when he was the most liquid, when he was sort of transitioning between these spaces. But not for a long time. I mean, it seems to me that Knight and Baraka and Lowell, they all sort of settle into themselves. And so my fear is that, like, is that always what happens? If you want to be as liquid as long as possible. So that would still be the response to that. Like, what you're looking for are ways for these guys to get away from that table, not abandon it, but to go away from it and then come back to it, like, the ebb and flow of a tide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the golden shovel, because you mentioned Brooks several times.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you were already getting towards that if we had more time with what you've done with Etheridge Knight.
Sure.
Just what does that form enact or signify for your own work individually as a poet?
Right.
But also to the extent that that form can be received or echoed by others. Like, is it about writing into a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, or is it about another poet deciding who for them plays a Gwendolyn Brooks-like role? Who would they? So I'm just curious if you can just talk.
Yeah, I mean, so if you don't know this poem, the quick story on that poem is just that I, at some point, wanted my 5-year-old to memorize a poem, and I thought that was short enough for him to memorize. So he memorized it, and then in my sort of working practice, words like practice I think are key to this kind of conversation, I just wrote it down the page one night doing writing, and then I wrote a poem that filled it in. And so it was just practice. It wasn't a form. It was in the house, and I wrote a poem. And what I'll say in terms of like any kind of conversation of poetics was that it was me engaging Brooks in a Viking fashion, which is to say, well, I'm thinking about her, but the best thing for me to do is make something, not to just think about her, not to just memorize it, but to actually make something in response to it. So the poem just sort of emerges out of that. And then what's happened with it, with people doing anthologies, I mean, I'm flattered, but I don't have so much control over that phenomena. But again, I would tie it to this idea of I make, therefore I grasp, and understanding the poem along those lines. Yeah.
Hey, Terrance.
Hey, what's up?
Great talk.
Thanks.
So as we were getting toward the end, I started thinking about Nell models, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was asking myself, well, where does USEP fit into this? Of course,
Sure.
you had that picture of USEP with the knife
Right.
at the end. And I'm wondering, one, if we put USEP at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the attitude towards vulnerability compared to Baraka,
Right.
would that be true? And also, two, would we also consider him, less liquid as his career went on, in the sense that, he is on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the attitude towards
Sure.
vulnerability, but maybe comparable to Baraka in the sense that less liquid as his writing life went on.
Yeah. And I imagine the end of the talk to really be open-ended in a way that I don't want to close it off, because that is a really interesting question for me. Like, who can we consider liquid, and how liquid should one be? So for Etheridge, I think it's true. For Yusuf, I think it's true. Part of his kind of liquid identity comes from being a Southerner, from being a Vietnam vet, and you can sort of see that. So that's the kind of, in terms of subject matter and evolution. But you might say like his aesthetics are maturing. The poetics of his poems over his body of work mature in a way that we mostly are taught is that's perfect, that's ideal, that you really are trying to settle into a particular kind of style. So does that make him less liquid? Maybe along these conversations. But as I said, I would leave that kind of possibility open for debate, because I don't know. When I was talking to Rob last night, I thought, well, it really for me to find an ideal model without leveling critiques against everyone, because again, it's it varies from poet to poet. And really, I'm talking about a kind of aspiration more than a kind of fact for myself. Do you know what I mean? So the critique whether Yusuf Komenyaka is liquid enough or not, to me, is too close to a kind of critique that I shouldn't be making at this point in my career. You know what I mean? Because what will I look like in 10 years? Like, I might be writing the exact same poems I'm writing today, and you would say, he's matured. But as I stand here, I'm saying apprenticeship is what I want to be. Liquid is what I want to be. I'm not interested in maturity, obviously. I'm not interested in maturity, mastery, those kinds of terms. But certainly, again, Yusuf Komenyaka is a mature and masterful poet. So the example I gave very quickly last night was like, well, I guess it would be like Miles Davis, who reached a level of mastery in the 60s with Kinda Blue and that modal jazz. And before that, even bebop, working with, I think he worked with Dizzy Gillespie. And then his adjacent possible relationship is that he marries, her name was Betty Mabry, and then she became Betty Davis in the early 70s. And Betty Davis had, I don't know if she dated or if they were just really good friends, Jimi Hendrix, I think she probably dated him. For a little while, she opened with Parliament Funkadelic. So he marries her, I think, after Cicely Tyson. And that's when he does the jazz fusion. So that's when he changes his clothes, Miles Davis, and he goes into this whole other form, and he does On the Corner. So the anecdote is that a reporter says to Miles Davis, I was with you, I've been with you all before. I loved Kind of Blue, and I loved what you were doing in the 50s, but this new stuff, this On the Corner stuff, I can't quite get with you. And then Miles Davis said, well, what you want me to do, motherfucker? Wait? So I tried to look for that quote last night. I was like, I'm gonna find out what year it was, who said it. So I typed in Miles Davis and motherfucker, and the whole page. He said it so much that it was impossible for me to find the quote. But on the other end of that, he also played around with hip hop, towards the end of his life as that sort of to prosper. And that's not good music. But the idea is not about mastery. It's not really about his level of success when he's doing jazz fusion, which I now like, or the weird hip hop stuff in the 80s. Everybody was destroyed in the 80s. But the idea is that he still was liquid, that he still was moving and sort of absorbing things. So is there a poet like that? That's the question. Is there a poet that maybe is more suitable than Knight for you? When we think about what does that mean, or if that even is a reasonable aspiration, ultimately is probably where I stand on that kind of question. Is it possible?
And I think the thing that is sticking right here in my chest is influence, and what you're saying about influence, because in this talk you've taken so much of the sting out of it, for me, that heaviness.
Sure.
And I'm wondering whether that's okay. I mean, because influence seems to be this, this building, kind of like this one, just this, all this marble.
Right.
And now it's chipped up and turning into this powder.
Right. Well, it's at the heart of, I mean, this is what Stephen Johnson is telling. His word, he never really says influence. He says how to come up, where good ideas come from, how to unlock kind of creativity and innovation. And I've just slid this word into it, which is to make a clear parallel, which is influence does lead to innovation and creativity, although we often think just the opposite. And I think that's an argument that he's making too. I'm just trying to apply it to poems. What I will say about like that, why this would be of interest to me, and I went deeper with this with Rob last night, is like, obviously I'm married to a poet. I'm part of many, many poetic networks. And so on the one hand, I love trying to be as connected to all those networks as possible, but often thinking about like how I want to say influence is a form of vulnerability, but someone else could make an argument that influence is a form of power. So who influences whom and who takes? So I feel like I'm negotiating that often in my own home about like, well, whose idea was that? That kind of idea, and trying to think of it in positive terms, because I ultimately think it is a very positive thing to be in a relationship that is influential. Yeah.
Well, on that note, thanks so much for coming out. Terrance's books are for sale in the back. He has a new book coming out very soon.
Let Terry ask her question, and then we'll stop.
Okay, Terry.
It was the last hand I saw.
Go on and bust out that question.
So my first question is, the ideal liquid artist, Hendrix, and can you not have some, achievement of, I don't want to say mastery or perfection, but can you not achieve the goal you want as an artist in one form, then move on to another and just continue to grow in that?
Right. That's a good question. I do like that idea because I feel like that's the only way for me to be liquid is just to leave this poetry thing behind and do painting. So the thing about Hendrix, and this also came up last night because I was mentioning it in reference to O'Hara, which is to say O'Hara wasn't especially liquid. He was in New York. He had a fairly set group of friends, but his sort of like thinking, the fact that he was at MoMA, his exaptation, the breadth of his reading made him liquid, but his sort of physical circumstances didn't make him especially liquid. And then we sort of say, oh yeah, but he died young, which also would be true for Hendrix. So then I think maybe Ginsberg, we might also be able to talk about Ginsberg. But again, when you look at the work, this is what I said about the separation for Baraka. You want it to be mostly in the work, not so much in the poet, but you're looking for evidence in the poem because I sort of think that's the most important thing. So Hendrix, I mean, yeah, he was performing with the Isley Brothers early on. So if you're thinking about him shifting from blues and R&B to heavy metal, perhaps. But again, that death seems to kind of like freeze us in a way that doesn't really let us know what does it mean for maturity, which is why I brought up Miles Davis. He lived long enough for us to think about maturity versus restlessness. All right, thanks.
All right.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.